Law enforcement versus national security. Confused priorities. Introduction. The subcommittee identified a number of cases in which law enforcement operations and criminal prosecutions were subordinated to other foreign policy concerns. More often than not, the interference with law enforcement processes was the result of ad hoc decisions made at the operational level of the national security agencies involved, rather than the product of carefully considered decisions made at the highest levels of our government. Instances in which foreign policy considerations took precedence over the war on drugs included the Barry Adler SEAL episode, law enforcement investigations into illegal activities associated with the Contras on the Southern Front, a narcotics sting operation directed at a high Bahamian government official, the intervention of U.S. officials on behalf of the Honduran general convicted in a narco-terrorism plot, and the handling of Panama's General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Accounts of the Bahamian sting and General Noriega were provided in the Bahamas and Panama chapters, respectively. Barry SEAL and the cartel. Barry Adler SEAL, a former narcotics smuggler, was utilized as an undercover agent by the DEA in a highly sensitive operation being run against the Colombian cocaine cartels and officials of the Sandinista regime in Managua. Based upon intelligence the DEA had received, an interest had been expressed by some members of the Sandinista Directorate in providing a base of operations in Nicaragua for the cartels. U.S. law enforcement officials had hoped to entrap both members of the cartels and Sandinista officials in a drug sting being run by SEAL. However, the operation was disclosed prematurely by an administration official who leaked to the press evidence supposedly collected by SEAL in an effort to influence a pending congressional vote on Contra aid. Law enforcement officials were furious that their undercover operation was revealed and agents' lives jeopardized because one individual in the U.S. government, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, decided to play politics with the issue. Associates of SEAL, who operated aircraft service businesses at the Mena, Arkansas airport, were also the targets of grand jury probes into narcotics trafficking. Despite the availability of evidence sufficient for an indictment on money laundering charges, and over the strong protests of state and federal law enforcement officials, the cases were dropped. The apparent reason was that the prosecution might have revealed national security information, even though all of the crimes which were the focus of the investigation occurred before SEAL became a federal informant. Bueso Rosa and the Contras. Senior U.S. government officials intervened with a federal judge to obtain a reduction to 5 years in the sentence for Honduran General Jose Bueso Rosa, who was convicted in 1985 of conspiring to assassinate President Suazo Cordoba of Honduras. The assassination attempt was to have been financed by the proceeds from the sale in the United States of $40 million in cocaine seized in connection with the plot. The other defendants in the case received sentences as long as 40 years. In addition, officials of the U.S. government intervened to ensure that Bueso Rosa served out his sentence in a minimum security facility at a U.S. military base in Florida. The officials intervened because the general was a friend of the U.S. government and had been of particular help to the U.S. military in Honduras. According to the admissions of the United States in the criminal trial of Oliver North, quote, Lieutenant Colonel North suggested that efforts be made on Bueso Rosa's behalf to deter him from disclosing details of his support of the Contras, end quote. These officials seemed unconcerned that the Justice Department had touted the conspiracy as the, quote, most significant case of narco-terrorism yet discovered, end quote. Mr. Mark M. Richard, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division for the Department of Justice, was adamantly opposed to these interventions. Originally, the Department of State supported the Justice Department's position in the Bueso Rosa case. Richard said that early on, the Pentagon took the initiative in support of interventions on behalf of Bueso Rosa. In a deposition before the Iran-Contra Committee, Richard recalled being called to a meeting which included, among others, Oliver North, General Paul Gorman, Elliot Abrams, and Dewey Claridge, who was representing the CIA. In that meeting, North, Gorman, Abrams, and Claridge all agreed that Bueso Rosa should be accommodated. Richard said he was surprised that the State Department's position had changed. Richard said he responded by saying, quote, "Look, anything we do for this man seems to undercut our position that we have repeatedly taken that this is an international terrorist. This is certainly not consistent with the position we have articulated throughout the course of this prosecution, that this man is a serious international terrorist and should be treated accordingly." End quote. Francis McNeil, in testimony before the subcommittee, said the successful intervention on behalf of Bueso Rosa over the objections of the Justice Department undermined President Reagan's policies in 3 areas: anti-terrorism, anti-narcotics, and support for democracy. Intelligence versus law enforcement. Despite obvious and widespread trafficking through the war zones of northern Costa Rica, the subcommittee was unable to find a single case against a drug trafficker operating in those zones which was made on the basis of a tip or report by an official of a U.S. intelligence agency. This is despite an executive order requiring intelligence agencies to report trafficking to law enforcement officials, and despite direct testimony that trafficking on the Southern Front was reported to CIA officials. Where traffickers and suspected traffickers were mentioned by name in documents divulged in the course of the Iran-Contra hearings, the names were deleted by the authorities charged with document declassification. This deletion was effected notwithstanding the fact that a copy of a memorandum detailing the trafficking activities written by Rob Owen and sent to Oliver North had already been widely circulated. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Feldman and FBI Special Agent Kevin Currier were sent to San Jose in 1986 to investigate illegal weapons shipments to the Contras operating in Costa Rica. Yet, U.S. Embassy officials were not only unsympathetic with their objectives, but also attempted to dissuade them from interviewing a key witness. In his testimony, Richard Gregory said that the failure of the State Department to turn over important materials was jeopardizing the prosecution in his case against Sarkis Saganalian, an arms dealer. Gregory testified that the case against General Noriega could well be jeopardized if U.S. intelligence agencies failed to come forward with information about the general's role in narcotics trafficking. Quote, "It is impossible to know with certainty in a world where the secret to conducting intelligence activity is compartmentalization. That is, you get information on a need-to-know basis. If a compartment goes out of whack, that is, if they go off on their own wild spree, there is nobody to supervise them. And if it happens that Mr. Noriega was working for a compartment I don't know about, and their superiors in other departments don't know about, there may be a whole source of information unknown to the prosecutor." End quote. Gregory, referring to the CIA, went on to say, quote, "With the Noriega case, we have requested the right to see certain things. I can honestly tell you that I am convinced that we have not seen even a small percentage of what we should see." End quote. Misguided priorities. Law enforcement operations directed at narcotics traffickers should be a clear government priority. Law enforcement agents who are on the front lines, day in and day out, of the war on drugs should be secure in the knowledge that as they develop evidence on anyone associated with the drug trade, their efforts will not be jeopardized or terminated for so-called national security considerations. The most graphic example of this conflict between law enforcement and foreign policy priorities is that of Richard Gregory, who for 8 years led the war on drugs in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. He had achieved a reputation as one of the nation's most effective and toughest federal narcotics prosecutors. Yet Gregory, in frustration, resigned his position in January of this year due to increasing opposition he was meeting from the State Department to his investigations and indictments of foreign officials. In an interview with NBC, aired on February 22, 1989, Gregory said the opposition from the State Department made it almost impossible to pursue top cocaine bosses. He stated in that interview, quote, "I'm finding the higher we go, the further I investigate matters involving Panama, high-level corruption in Colombia, and Honduras and the Bahamas, they are concerned that we are going to cause a problem in foreign policy areas, and that is more important than stopping the dope problem." End quote. Gregory said he felt a lot like the soldiers in Vietnam felt. Quote, "We are not being allowed to win this war." End quote. The Drug Enforcement Administration has expressed a clear reluctance to develop cases against officials of foreign governments because of that agency's status as a guest in the countries where it operates. Many law enforcement officials in South Florida have been discouraged in pursuing cases that lead to the Bahamas because of past interventions by the foreign policy agencies of our government. When cases are brought against those individuals in the drug trade, prosecutors should be able to rely upon the cooperation of all the agencies of the federal government to assist them in indictments and prosecutions. Obviously, secrecy is essential to maintaining the security of certain U.S. government operations. However, the concern for secrecy and the need for the classification of important national security information should not be an insurmountable obstacle for prosecutors in their ability to obtain evidence critical in waging a more effective war on drugs. In addition, the Nicaraguan War complicated law enforcement efforts, particularly in South Florida, at a time when the illicit narcotics trade mushroomed out of control. A unique problem surfaced with the privatization of U.S. foreign policy in Central America at the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. The following section to this chapter discusses the nature of this problem. The consequences of privatizing U.S. foreign policy. A major consequence of privatizing support for the Contras, particularly during the Boland Amendment prohibition on official U.S. government assistance, was that it attracted numerous individuals and organizations involved in illicit activities. As revealed during the Iran-Contra hearings, an extensive network of private support for the Contras was established and coordinated by a handful of government officials working with private organizations. Although it might have been unintended, this private support network, encouraged by certain officials of the U.S. government, served as a magnet for many individuals who exploited their activities on behalf of the Contras as a cover for illegal gun running and narcotics trafficking. It appears that anyone or any organization was welcomed as participants in supporting the Contra cause. The private efforts on behalf of the Contras attracted a number of drug traffickers who understood full well the high priority the U.S. government gave to the war against Nicaragua. Testimony before the subcommittee revealed narcotics traffickers were particularly astute in offering to assist the Contras in an effort to not only protect their operations, but also to avoid prosecution for their activities as well. This technique is known as ticket punching. In the environment of South Florida, with exiles from around Latin America plotting a variety of activities aimed at toppling left-wing regimes around the hemisphere, and with legal and illegal covert operations commonplace, the opportunities for ticket punching are endless. According to Richard Gregory of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami, the result is a prosecutor's nightmare. The subcommittee repeatedly encountered this phenomenon as it tried to understand the relationship between law enforcement and foreign policy priorities. Many of the stories connecting the Contras and drug trafficking were the result of efforts by traffickers to establish a cover for their operations by marrying them to covert activities and to revolutionary groups desperate for help. Ramon Milian Rodriguez's offer to assist the Contras was not made until he was arrested on drug-related charges. The offer was an obvious attempt to reverse the legal proceedings being brought against him. George Morales, the convicted cocaine trafficker, was quite candid that his primary motivation in providing support to Eden Pastora's organization was his belief that the CIA would actually intervene to assist him with his legal problems. Unlike Milian Rodriguez, Morales, in fact, delivered planes, weapons, and money to the Contras, who were desperate for help at the time. When his relationship with the Contras developed more fully, Morales began to take advantage of the Contra infrastructure to enhance his drug operations. Diaxa, which was the headquarters for the Floyd Carlton Alfredo Caballero Cocaine Transportation Organization, was paid by the State Department's NHAO office as a supplier of humanitarian assistance to the Contras. Caballero was indicted on drug charges and entered into a plea agreement with U.S. authorities. Carlton was one of the key federal grand jury witnesses in the drug indictments brought against Panama's General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Setco was the recipient in 1986 of $185,924 in State Department NHAO office funds for the transport of humanitarian assistance to the FDN based in Honduras. A 1983 U.S. Customs Service report stated that, quote, Setco Aviation is a corporation formed by American businessmen who are dealing with Mata and are smuggling narcotics into the United States, end quote. The Mata referred to in the report is Juan Mata Ballesteros, a major cocaine trafficker in the region and wanted by U.S. law enforcement agencies for the brutal murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena in Mexico. Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas, a Costa Rican seafood company, was owned and operated by convicted drug traffickers Luis Rodriguez, Carlos Soto, and Ubaldo Fernandez. Frigoríficos received $231,587 in humanitarian assistance funds for the Contras from the State Department in late 1985 and early 1986. Luis Rodriguez was finally indicted on September 30th, 1988, for drug smuggling, which took place between November 1980 and January 1983. Tom Posey, Mario Calero, Jack Terrell, Frank Castro, Joe Adams, and Rene Corbo were all indicted in August 1988 for Neutrality Act violations that occurred in 1985 and 1986. The FBI had extensive investigative files on Corbo, who readily admitted that he had been providing weapons to the Contras in violation of the Neutrality Act. All claimed they were acting on behalf and with the encouragement of the U.S. government in the Contra war against Nicaragua. The case of Michael Palmer. The most puzzling example of this phenomenon the subcommittee encountered was the case of Michael Palmer. Palmer's career as a drug smuggler also included numerous government associations that clearly revealed a government working at cross purposes. Palmer was a former Delta Airlines flight engineer who went into the marijuana business with Lee Rich and Michael Vogel in the late 1960s. He participated in the smuggling of hundreds of tons of marijuana into the United States over a 6-year period without getting caught. In 1984, he flew to Colombia with a load of money to purchase a large shipment of marijuana. The plane was trapped on the ground by the Colombian military, and Palmer was thrown into jail. As he sat in jail, he had the chance to contemplate the risks he faced. There was a strong probability that his organization had been compromised and that one or more of its members were working with the police. He risked being identified as the key figure in a multi-billion-dollar drug ring and face a possible life sentence. For Palmer, the message was clear. Get out of jail in Colombia and go to work for the U.S. government. Depending on the story one chooses to believe, Palmer was either released because the Colombians had no case against him or because his friends paid off Colombian officials. Upon his return to the United States, he told his former colleagues that he was retiring and promptly looked for government agencies which would be able to use his services. Palmer's major assets were an interest in a DC-6, which had been involved in drug smuggling operations, an interest in Vortex, a minor Miami-based air cargo business, and excellent connections in the drug world. Within a matter of months after his return to the United States, Palmer was handling humanitarian cargoes for the State Department, working for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and informing for an office of the Customs Service. Palmer's decision to become a government informant was prescient because he was, in fact, indicted in Detroit for his role in the marijuana smuggling operation. His ploy worked. Over the objections of law enforcement agencies involved in the case against him, Palmer's indictment was dropped as, quote, not being in the interest of the United States, end quote. Throughout Palmer's career as a government informant, the various agencies using him did not seem to know that he was involved in more than one operation with more than one agency. In fact, some agencies were tracking him as a smuggler, unaware that he was doing the smuggling for DEA. Palmer's varied government operations all involved using the same airplane. The results were chaos and confusion. The DC-6, which was the centerpiece of Palmer's operation, had been purchased in 1979 and had been used to pick up a multi-ton load of marijuana in Colombia. The plane was overloaded and hit some trees and shrubs as it took off from Colombia. According to Michael Vogel, Palmer's partner, the plane flew north with tree limbs and shrubs sticking out of the wings. The intended destination was a farm in Tennessee, but because of the damage, the crew had to dump the load of drugs over a small town in Georgia. The plane landed in Tallahassee, and the occupants fled before the police closed in. The plane was seized and left on the runway at Tallahassee for several years before it was retrieved from the government by Palmer's lawyer. Palmer invested a substantial sum of money in rebuilding the plane and gave it to Vortex's Steve Herreros in exchange for an interest in his company. Herreros had several air freight contracts for which he could use the plane. When Palmer decided to become an informant, the plane became an essential part of the plan. DEA wanted him to fly to Colombia, where the plane would be used to entrap a Colombian smuggling ring. The Colombians agreed to sell Palmer marijuana, and a load was sent back to Detroit. Unfortunately, Palmer testified, the DEA did not properly coordinate with the Customs Service. According to Palmer, customs agents in Detroit who did not know he was working for the government came close to shooting him and breaking up the entire operation before the DEA could find out who the distributors were and before DEA could complete the sting. At the same time Palmer was flying drugs as part of a DEA sting, the DC-6 was being used for State Department humanitarian assistance flights to the Contras. Members of the press corps had become aware of the plane and suspected that the plane was a key link between the drug trade and the covert war in Central America. They staked out the plane and began to investigate Palmer's background. In the meantime, Palmer and his partner were repainting the plane and changing its tail numbers to make it less conspicuous. Each of the tail number changes and new paint jobs was recorded by a professional photographer at the Miami airport who makes his living tracking alterations made in the appearance of junk planes parked at the airport's famous corrosion corner. Unknown to the covert operators or the DEA, the photographer sold copies of the pictures to the press, which was now sure it found the link between covert operations and drug trafficking. On one occasion, the plane returned from Central America and was subjected to a careful search at the Miami airport. The pilot protested, claiming that the search endangered sophisticated navigation equipment which had been installed for government operations. He asked that Palmer be called to the scene to verify the fact that the plane was being used on an official government operation. The customs officials were incredulous because they knew that Palmer was under indictment in Detroit in a huge marijuana smuggling case. To their amazement, Palmer got the government to acknowledge the plane. As the public controversy about Palmer grew, the different law enforcement agencies involved with the case could not agree on how it should be handled. DEA wanted his Detroit case dropped because of his undercover work, while other agencies suspected that he was continuing his own drug business using his work for the DEA as cover. The Detroit prosecutor decided to drop the charges against Palmer, a decision which infuriated Palmer's former partners in the marijuana business, who all received long prison terms. The case of Frank Camper. The story of Frank Camper is one clear example of how the privatization of foreign policy could lead to tragedy. Camper is a Vietnam veteran who began working as an informant out of Birmingham, Alabama, for the FBI in the early 1970s. In 1980, Camper decided to establish, quote, a private school for people who would be interested in paramilitary work, end quote, which he called the Mercenary School. Advertising in publications like Soldier of Fortune, Gung Ho, and Eagle, Camper conducted 2-week paramilitary training courses for individuals and groups. While training these individuals, Camper was acting as an informant for the FBI and military intelligence. The training provided by Camper included instruction in assassination techniques, the use of plastic explosives, and various bombing techniques. From the beginning, the Camper School attracted violent and extreme elements. Among Camper's first students was Robert Lisbonby, who, according to Camper, was planning a public bombing and assassination in Miami. Camper informed law enforcement agents, and the plot was halted. Other Camper students, quote, used the techniques that they had learned, end quote, at his school to steal items from the Redstone military base in northern Alabama. According to Camper, he founded the school with 2 principles in mind. First, to, quote, enable the U.S. government to gain a great deal of intelligence and indeed initiate many operations that were successful to stop criminals and terrorists, end quote. Second, quote, to get and prove out possible foreigners who would work for the U.S. government in the future, end quote. Between 1981 and 1986, Camper received approximately more than $25,000 from the U.S. government in connection with these operations. As Camper's school became increasingly well known, he found himself being drawn into contact with representatives of foreign governments and with the Contra program. Camper testified that in 1984, he was approached by members of the Panamanian Defense Forces who wanted him to participate in training programs for PDF anti-terrorism commando units. Camper said he learned during a meeting in Panama that the PDF was working with the Medellin cocaine cartel and reported this information to military intelligence. Camper claimed that military intelligence did not follow up on the information he had provided them. The same year, the Civilian Military Assistance Group, CMA, of Decatur, Georgia, began sending individuals who wanted to fight with the Contras to train with Camper for, quote, deep penetration raids into Nicaragua, end quote. These individuals were later expelled from Honduras. Camper also trained members of CMA who went to fight with the Contras on the Southern Front, working with John Hull. Among them were British mercenaries Peter Glibbery and John Davies, who were arrested by Costa Rican officials in April 1985 after conducting a raid in Nicaragua. Camper also participated in training members of an exile group attempting to conduct a coup against the Ghanaian government. These individuals were later arrested on a barge off the coast of Brazil as they were heading for Ghana and imprisoned. In November 1984, 4 Sikh nationalists were trained at Camper's school. The Sikhs asked Camper to train them in guerrilla tactics for a war against the government of India following the assassination of Indira Gandhi and the Indian government's assault on the Sikh Golden Temple. Camper advised the FBI of the Sikhs' plans. Camper testified the FBI advised him to continue training the Sikhs as a means of monitoring their activities. Camper testified that as a result of this monitoring, the FBI was able to stop planned assassinations of Rajiv Gandhi and an Indian state minister, and that many of the Sikh terrorists were arrested. Other Sikhs trained by the Camper school escaped. According to Camper, the Sikhs used plastic explosives they obtained from his school to blow up Air India Flight 182 over the Atlantic in June 1985, killing 329 people. Camper's school was closed after he was arrested in 1986 on weapons and racketeering charges in connection with a Los Angeles bombing. The Frank Camper story exemplifies many of the perils of the privatization of foreign policy. While being monitored by the FBI and the military, Camper was permitted to train individuals who participated in military expeditions, attempted coups, and bombings involving many nations. While the missions were clearly not authorized by the U.S., many of them were tolerated in a period that U.S. foreign policymakers were seeking to engage the U.S. in a variety of low-intensity conflicts using a mixture of private and public resources. The tragic irony is that Camper's school was the source for the training and plastic explosives used to blow up the Air India plane. This occurred even though the operation was being monitored by the FBI, and highlights the risks of permitting private military training camps to operate in the United States. The case of Richard Brennicky. Certainly, one of the unintended consequences of the privatization of U.S. policy toward Nicaragua were the number of individuals who surfaced claiming to have been engaged in illicit activities on behalf of federal agencies supporting the Contras. One such individual was Richard Brennicky. Brennicky is the president of a Portland, Oregon property management company. According to him, in his spare time, he had been involved in arms deals in the Middle East and Central America, and as a participant in a number of covert operations. Brennicky first came to the subcommittee's attention through Will Northrop, one of the defendants in the Evans Iranian arms sale case in New York. Brennicky was the source for a lengthy New York Times story on weapons sales to Iran. In that story, he recounted his purported role in the Demavand project, which he said was the code name for a weapons purchasing operation run by the Iranian government. Some months later, Brennicky began to assert publicly that he had participated in a guns for drug arrangement in Central America, which was officially sanctioned by the U.S. government. As part of this arrangement, he said he had smuggled drugs into the United States and arranged weapons purchases for the Contras in Eastern Europe. As the result of these new assertions, the staff contacted Mr. Brennicky, who agreed to be deposed. The deposition was taken on April 23, 1988, in Portland, Oregon. In his testimony, Brennicky asserted that he had worked for the CIA as a contract employee in the Middle East in the 1970s, that he became involved working for Israeli intelligence and the CIA in the early 1980s. He claimed that in the course of his dealings, he was asked by the Israelis to make arrangements for the purchase and shipment of Eastern European weapons to the Contras. He said that after clearing the request with the CIA, he bought the weapons from Omnipol in Czechoslovakia and had the weapons shipped to a warehouse in Bolivia. He said that the Israelis then flew the weapons to Panama and Honduras. Brennicky said that he had worked closely with a number of Israeli agents active in the Central American Weapons Project who were running drugs into the United States. He said that he was told by White House officials that the operation was officially sanctioned, and he had personally discussed the operation with members of the vice president's staff. The subcommittee then began an exhaustive effort to determine whether Brennicky's sworn statement had any basis in fact. Dozens of individuals whom Brennicky had named in his deposition were interviewed. Thousands of pages of documents from government files relating to him and thousands more from his files and other sources were reviewed. A careful analysis of the files shows that he spent considerable effort unsuccessfully in trying to become an intelligence agent, and when that failed, an arms dealer. The records show that Brennecke was never officially connected to U.S. intelligence, and that he was never tasked by a U.S. intelligence agency to gather information. Although Brennecke produced thousands of pages of documents relating to proposed arms deals, there is no evidence that any of them ever came to fruition. Brennecke began telling stories about his secret life as a spy sometime after he was stopped by the Customs Service coming through the Seattle airport on a return trip from Europe. He was carrying a briefcase which contained references to arms deals. The Customs Service wanted to know whether he was involved in illegal weapons transactions. His response was to offer to become a customs informant. The subcommittee confirmed that Brennecke applied for a job with the CIA when he finished school, but his application was rejected. He worked for an international banker and securities dealer and spent some time in the Middle East and Central America. As the result of his employment, he developed contacts in the world of international arms dealers. When the Iran-Iraq War intensified, the adversaries went into the world market to buy weapons. A number of Brennecke's old contacts asked him to join them in their efforts to sell weapons to both sides. Brennecke traveled to Europe and met with his old contacts and with representatives of both the Iranian and Iraqi arms purchasing missions. He traveled to Czechoslovakia and met with representatives of Omnipol, the Czech arms company. Although Brennecke's files are filled with evidence of this travel and of correspondence arranging meetings, he did not produce any evidence of any business transacted. There are no signed contracts, invoices, shipping instructions, delivery records, end-user certificates, whether real or falsified, or financial records of any kind to support the assertion that he was an active participant in arms deliveries to either Iran or Iraq. Moreover, Brennecke did not produce any evidence that he was reimbursed for any of the expenses he incurred while trying to arrange arms deals. It appears that Brennecke learned about the secret U.S. arms deals with Iran from his business associates, who in turn had learned about them from the Iranians. It also appears that Brennecke received completely fabricated information about arms deals from undercover agents of the Customs Service who were setting up a sting operation and were talking to his business associates. When direct efforts to arrange the arms deals failed, Brennecke began to tell every agency of the United States government which would listen that he could get the hostages in Lebanon released. In exchange, he wanted the right to sell weapons to the Iranians. Approaches were made through Marine Corps Intelligence, the State Department's Office of Trade and Commercial Affairs, and the Defense Department. These approaches were all passed on to the Customs Service, which at that time was in the process of preparing the Sam Evans case in New York. Customs agents interviewed Brennecke extensively, reviewed his records, and decided that he had little to offer. He appears not to have been indicted in the Evans case because he did not play any substantive role in the transactions which were at issue. Undaunted by his failure to secure authority to negotiate with the Iranians over hostages, Brennecke began to offer additional proposals to various federal agencies, including the Defense Department, to trade the Iranians U.S. weapons for Soviet-made T-80 tanks. These offers were rejected both because of the negative assessment which had been made of him and Brennecke's demand that he be allowed to sell weapons to the Iranians. Conclusion. The Senate and House Select Committees, which were constituted to investigate the Iran-Contra affair, described in detail how the Oliver North operations undermined basic U.S. foreign policy objectives. In their report, the Select Committee noted, quote, "Covert operations of this government should only be directed and conducted by trained professional services that are accountable to the President and the Congress. Such operations should never be delegated as they were here to private citizens in order to evade governmental restrictions." End quote. The Select Committee observed further that, quote, "The President set the stage for welcoming a huge donation for the Contras from a foreign government, a contribution clearly intended to keep the Contras in the field while U.S. aid was barred. The NSC staff thereafter solicited other foreign governments for military aid, facilitated the efforts of U.S. fundraisers to provide lethal assistance to the Contras, and ultimately developed and directed a private network that conducted, in North's words, a full-service covert operation in support of the Contras. End quote. The subcommittee members believe it is important to reinforce the concerns laid out by the Iran-Contra committees. Not only did the actions of the North Network undermine our government's war on terrorism, but they also damaged the war on drugs. Throughout the decade of the 1980s, the two threats which have exacted a tragic human toll in the lives of our citizens have been the actions of the political terrorists and narco-terrorists. Yet, in the name of supporting the Contras, we abandoned the responsibility our government has for protecting our citizens from all threats to their security and well-being. Those U.S. officials who were involved in encouraging and actively pursuing the participation of private individuals and organizations in the Contra supply network must bear the responsibility for the illegal activities of those who responded to that call. When accountability is sacrificed in support of a cause, control over those who exploit the situation for their own illicit ends is lost as well. Those U.S. officials who turned a blind eye to General Noriega, who intervened on behalf of General Bueso Rosa, and who adamantly opposed the investigations of foreign narcotics figures by honest, hard-working law enforcement officials, must also bear the responsibility for what is happening in the streets of the United States today. As Gregory stated so succinctly in this interview, quote, "If it was the communists that were taking over South and Central America, we would have done something about it. But it's the drug dealers, and therefore they, the government, don't see that as a significant priority." End quote. The casualty list for the continued narrow perception as to what constitutes threats to the national security of the United States has grown quite lengthy, particularly with the Iran-Contra episode. It includes the people of the United States who are threatened on a daily basis by narcotics-related violence sweeping the country. There are few neighborhoods in the United States that are secure from this threat. It is individuals like Richard Gregory, an exceptional public servant who tirelessly gave of himself to protect the citizens of this country, but who finally gave up because his own government would not allow him to win the war on drugs. It is the credibility of government institutions who turn a blind eye to domestic and foreign corruption associated with the international narcotics trade because of the perception there are higher foreign policy priorities which demand our attention. In the end, the Contras themselves became victims of the very network created to support them. This is Our Hidden History